Good morning, Mike. How you doing?
Hey, good morning, Steve. Happy Tuesday,
Happy
April
Tuesday.
7th.
April's going by fast, man, isn't
It is first
it?
week
Yeah,
down. And some good news today. Did you catch Governor Cuomo yesterday and the
I did.
task force update? I
Yeah,
mean, we obviously are still into some dark times ahead this week and next week as we peak, but looks like the data is beginning to shift some of those models. Have you checked into some of that?
yeah. No, I listened to Governor Cuomo's update yesterday, and no, that is good news. And if the trajectory that he was illustrating on screen, and to be fair to him, he said this is what it looks like. We just can't confirm that this will be the case. Um, it looks a lot more conservative than our than what was sort of projected by multiple models, which is good, right? It's good. It's the action that's been taken, the sort of hardship that everyone's going through, the practice of physical distancing. Going
Yes.
back to how you said it yesterday, which is great, is working, right? People complying. And obviously, he also did other things where he increased the fines for those who are not adhering to physical distancing so that people sort of heed the advice and sort of listen to him. So this what looks like a plateau sort of is a plateau and not just a misleading plateau.
Yeah, well, I hope it
Yeah,
sounds like the big measurements that they're looking at now are things like new hospital admissions, new ICU admissions, new intubations, things like that are on the
yeah,
decline,
yeah.
or have leveled off, at least in New York, which is the hardest hit. There are other spots that are bubbling up still, New Orleans and Chicago and,
Mm,
and other places. But, I keep a close eye here on Virginia and that model I shared with you that does kind of layer in the hospital resources, number of beds, number of ICU units available, along with the projections. That model has shifted dramatically over the weekend. I didn't realize it till after we talked yesterday, but I was telling you how that the mitigation was working, the flattening the curve was happening, and we were pushing things back. And I was kind of upset because it looked like things weren't even going to peak until late May here in Virginia, and then that means the downward curve wasn't going to hit until like August. And it was like, this is wow, we got a long journey ahead. But they shifted the models, the data came in, and now they're saying our peak is like 14 days away, end of April, and by June 1st, the downward slope of the curve is back to near zero. So again, we're not going to get to zero, right? We're always going to have
right.
cases out there. But Dr. Fauci said, I thought something very interesting in the task force meeting yesterday. And I just kind of, it was like a 2 hour task force report. I just kind of scanned through, look for Dr. Fauci, look for Dr. Birx. And he was like, listen, the models are great. We need the models. It helps us to plan and put these actions into place, but data trumps models. And it sounds like the data is just beginning to shift a little, and they were very cautiously optimistic. They didn't want
Yeah.
to be too hopeful, but listen, I'm a cautiously optimistic guy. So when I hear those types of reports, it really excites me, and I hope that we don't hope we take it as good news, and if it does pan out, that things get back sooner. Than some of these conversations we're having here about workplace and returning to the office and how that looks, and how we as workplace leaders, FM leaders, corporate real estate executives make these decisions. It's going to become sooner than later. So we need to maybe start talking about it, because June will be here before we know it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if it is June. And let's hope so, right? Let's hope so. I think what's also interesting is some of the narratives changing, right? So it's how do we get the economy back? How do we get people back to work? How do we get people to feel safe going out in the streets? Um, and that's
That's
going to be
huge.
interesting,
Yeah.
But it's a good narrative to be sort of hearing more and more of.
Were you concerned about that? Because I am. I mean, I think that we've scared people into a place of real hesitancy, and we've put people in isolation. Again, not saying that wasn't the way to go. I think some of the things we've talked about over the last couple of weeks here, we could debate the news media and how they portray things in an alarmist fashion to get people's attention, get people's eyeballs. And I think, there's kind of this catch 22. You'd use those tactics to get people to act, to take social distancing, I'm sorry, physical distancing seriously. It seems like a lot of those things were driven to to make sure we do what we needed to do to stop that spike, right? So now we've implanted this high level of anxiety and fear as people sit in isolation. And now we're going to tell them, if we start to have this conversation, I knew we had to have it. I've mentioned this several times. We have to have a vision and a plan for getting back to work, to give people that comfort level that the facilities have been disinfected and cleaned. And here are the new protocols in place for you as an employee, for visitors when they come in. And there's all things we could talk about. I've read some things in recent days about what that looks like. Do you have some type of a proof of immunity or antibodies? Have you had to test the things like testing and being able to have protocols in place for when future people are diagnosed, because it will continue even past a vaccine. This is going to go on. This is going to be something where people are going to be diagnosed with this even after we have a vaccine and all the treatments and all those things. So what are the plans what's the action we take? And if someone in your office is diagnosed, then you're back to that strategy of containment as opposed to this lockdown mitigation. So we have to get people mentally prepared for that. I mean, do you think through that type of thing? Because I had a great conversation last week, if you didn't hear it, from Rex Miller and Carrie Weckelo, where we talked about well-being and mental health in this crisis, and the fact that both of them seem to indicate that we're in store for some tough times, trying to get people back to whatever the new normal looks like, because there's going to be a level of PTSD, I'm sorry, that will be lingering under the subconscious for many of us, because we're hyper aware now. Have you thought through those kind of implications at all?
I haven't, obviously conscious of it. And what does that mean for society? What does that mean for the organizations we represent? What does that mean for the industry? And then what does it mean for ourselves, right? You're a guy who travels a lot, so
Yeah.
you go to a lot of conferences, as I often say, you're a big ticket item, so it's
Not sure about that,
so
but
but it's so how do events start? How do you get on a plane? How do you get from A to B? How do we mentally, and I totally agree with you. So how do you mentally get on the subway? How do you mentally get on a train? So how do we get to that? And I don't know what the narrative is going to be. It's going to be interesting, and I think it's going to be an individual decision. I think organizations will probably be um what's the right word I'm looking for? They'll understand,
flexible.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
I
think
mean,
flexible will be the key. And I think it'll be interesting to see how long they allow that flexibility, whether it is a ongoing flexibility, whether it's a you know, timed flexible arrangement. It's going to be interesting because no, we don't know, right? We don't know how this impacts us, how it impacts society, and geographies all go through different phases of it. So if we look at the New York trends, I live in Nassau County. Nassau County is where it's spiking at the moment. So a lot of the new cases in New York State is actually coming from Nassau County. So it's kind of moving its way out through Long Island. So it's just going to be difficult. And it's when New York peaks, how does it affect Connecticut, New Jersey? How does that then affect Pennsylvania and all the way up, through the states? It'll be interesting. I don't know what the answer is. I really don't.
yeah,
I'm really intrigued to see how leaders think of it, how they plan for it. And I'm sure leaders are talking with other leaders of other organizations to sort of getting other people's perspectives, getting other people's opinions, so that there is a consistent and a collective viewpoint, so that everyone feels they're being looked after and every organization is doing the same thing. It's going to be
I
interesting.
can't help but smile, Steve, because your consistency is amazing. I just released this morning this week's podcast episode, and I decided to turn it into make people aware of the weekly Workplace Interactive live stream that we do every
Hmm.
Wednesday at noon
Yeah.
Eastern. So that is something that's been separate. We've been doing, and we've been doing the podcast on Tuesdays. But today I took highlights from the first few interactive live streams. And of course, I can't thank you enough. You were one of my first guests of the first ever live stream back on March 18th. So not quite a month ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, a little over 3 weeks ago. And at the time, it's amazing how fast things have changed in 3
Mhm,
weeks.
mhm,
If
mhm.
you look at the tone of those conversations, I've done 3 live streams. It'll be the 4th tomorrow. So it's almost a month, but the tone of the conversation that you and Elizabeth Redmond and I had, and Maddie, of course, my co-host,
Yeah.
you were talking about, we were focused on overseas and what was going on in Asia Pac and other parts of the world, and maybe anticipating a little bit how things might play out here in the U.S. That was before the collective lockdowns and stay-at-home orders were put into place, and all the things that have happened since. It just seems like that was so long ago, doesn't it? But even at the time, and I saved this clip, I wanted just to give a little 20-minute podcast today that showed some highlights from those hour-plus long live streams. And your comment was at the time was, listen, everybody's looking at this differently. Governments, local governments, governors, and making their state-to-state decisions. And you were like, how do you, as a corporate leader, make decisions if you have an organization that's located in all these different, not only regions
Mhm.
of the country here, but across the globe? And it was really something you just said again. I think when it comes to re-entering the new normal, whatever that might look like, and whenever that happens again, none of this is to indicate we're jumping the gun and overlooking the near term troubles that we'll be through, and we're still in the midst of this thing full steam and haven't even reached the worst of it in all by all accounts.
Mhm.
But April 7th today, if we get to April 30th, which is the current 30-day guidance from the Fed about locking down, then we start evaluating May and how do we begin planning in May to maybe get back into something in the summer. It's going to be region by region. It's going to be locality by locality. And then it has that human factor of how people will feel about it. In New York City is going to be different than how they feel, in the suburbs of Kansas or somewhere. So I think that's where I really get hopeful and I cautiously optimistic that they're starting to think about those things. And some of the
Mhm.
questions the media were asking yesterday were indicating that they want to know those answers, which is the questions I've been asking for weeks. So maybe it's now appropriate to start having some more discussions with workplace leaders, strategists that will really start helping us put together a plan for utilizing technology, leveraging workplace strategies, the work from home, teleworking. And now that we've had this experiment, we have a lot more data, a lot more information, and we can begin to make some decisions. So we'll see, but it's hopefully a time we'll look back on this broadcast and say that was maybe the beginning of a turning point towards the positive, which would be a lot sooner than I think we were thinking just a week or two ago.
Oh, and whenever you think the narrative of what Governor Cuomo was saying yesterday, and you compare that to some of the projections that they were looking at, it would be remarkable. It would be such a blessing for that to be the case. It is
Absolutely.
because it's a lot lower. And just the other thing I was sort of thinking, I know a big concern in the media is we come up to Easter this weekend. There's a lot of people obviously want to go and attend the religious ceremonies, no matter what the faith there are or they have. And it'll be interesting to see how many people actually, do take the advice, do stay at home and attend online services, or actually go to physical churches, because there's a many that are actually, still keeping their doors opening, and a lot of people are still visiting. So, and it's a tough time because given the momentous, of the Easter ceremony and what Easter means to people, it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, that's me and my cynicism about this media, but my church and everybody I know has been using virtual services for the last 3, 4 weeks. We've been doing 4 weeks now and can plan to continue to do so. So vast majority, from what I understand, is that places of worship are doing the responsible thing and not holding services in person. There's one church that keeps showing on the news. I think it's down in Texas somewhere that
Yeah,
there's a guy
yeah.
who refuses to do it. And I've seen it multiple times on multiple different days that's the poster child for the irresponsible church leader who's, unfortunately, making that decision. But again, you also said in the clip I grabbed from you from 4 weeks ago that you don't know what to believe when it comes to the media reports and the data,
It's
and
true.
that's always going to be the case, right? We don't know
Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
what picture they're trying to paint, what they're trying to, how they're trying to manipulate the masses into some perspective one way or another. So
Yeah.
I'm super skeptical when I see those reports, and I think it's downright irresponsible sometimes. And again, this is gonna don't let me get too far off track, but I know that there are contingency plans being made should the worst case scenarios have happened where resources were so strained. And I know Governor Cuomo said we're stressed in New York. This healthcare system is stressed. There's no doubt. There's folks that are struggling and are, again, all great respect and shout outs and thankfulness to all the frontline workers, the healthcare workers, and everyone keeping these facilities going. And we don't ever take lightly what they're doing, but the media loves to hear that there's plans being made for rationing of ventilators or rationing of services where they're going to let people die because they don't have enough resources. And again, those plans need to be in place, but to highlight them, at least to highlight them as if they're happening now. And that's confusing. You watch the news, you think it's happening now, that there's people dying because they don't have a ventilator. My understanding, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but as of April 7th, there's been no reports of people having to choose, this person gets a ventilator, this person doesn't. That's just not happening, even in the worst hit parts of our country. Yes, it's possible should that spike have continued, and it still may be. And I don't want to say anything here that's not accurate, but the media reports that like it's happening. And then they also are reporting, I think the guy in New York had to pull back on the reports that they're planning to make makeshift graves or something because they don't have enough room in the morgues or what have you. And that's not happening yet. It could happen should things go bad. But the way they report it is it's happening now, and
Hmm.
this is horrible, and it's doomsday. You know what I'm saying? The difference
Yeah.
between
Yeah.
responsible reporting of what possibly could be versus making it sound like this is happening now. Is that something you're seeing?
No, for sure, for sure. And it's you don't know what's true, what's not true, and that's the biggest challenge, right? And we just have to keep following it. And yeah, let's hope that's not the case. And part of one of the other things, and I don't know where your mind sits with this, but if what would it take for you to have to go to a hospital, given what the circumstances are in the hospital? So, everyone can answer that question for themselves.
Yeah.
And for me, I would have to be in absolute dire straits to contemplate going to the hospital, given the the likelihood of coming home in that environment is probably low. So that's sort of something that I've thought about the reconciliation in my own head.
Wait. If
Pure
you have appendicitis, heaven forbid, you have a
Oh, don't
emergency.
get of course, if
Yeah.
if
Okay.
something like
I
that.
thought
Yeah,
you were
yeah, no,
talking
no, no,
about
no,
just like I
no,
feel
no,
sick, I need to go to the hospital.
no, no. So if I suspected, I had symptoms for COVID-19, that's what I'm talking
Okay.
about. Not
Okay.
if I had other issues or other concerns. That's different. But even then, well, obviously you don't have a choice. You got to go. But if you go to the hospital, what are the chances? And I think people may have went to the hospital initially with symptoms, minor symptoms, but I think people are choosing or electing not to go. So I think maybe things are underreported because people just stay at home and fight it out, so to speak. What is your
Yeah.
view?
Yeah. I tell you, I get where you're coming from, but I don't think we need to think of that way. Again, I understand why you would have that thought process, and
Yeah,
I have had the thought process myself, but not everybody. In fact, the majority of people that enter the hospital and get treated for this thing and even get on a
that's true.
ventilator, they come off and
That's
they
true.
recover. But they don't like to report those things. They recover.
Yeah,
They show these great profiles, and it's awfully sad for every individual who's out there who's been impacted by this, friend, family, and we all have been touched in some way already. And I think most of us will know someone who has certainly had coronavirus or even succumbed to it, and a family member. It's each one is a tragedy, and I think that's the point. I hope the media is reporting those things in a way that to help us remember the individuals that are suffering. But the vast statistics and the data still says that most people recover from this. And even those who go into the hospital, even those that go into ICU for a period of maybe even a couple of weeks on a ventilator, will come off and recover. There's a good chance that that happens, but you don't. It's a risk thing. It is a scary proposition because as Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the
Hmm.
UK is an example. He's about our age, right? He's maybe, I don't know how old he is, but he's just a normal, what looked like to be a healthy guy. Had some minor symptoms, was going to ride it out at home. Then goes to the hospital for precautionaries, and now here, April 7th, he's on, in ICU. I don't think he's on a ventilator. They haven't reported that, but yeah, those things come to your mind, and absolutely, none of us are immune from that
Right.
chance. But I think that's where we need to step back and find perspective, and I think we need to get more data, more information. And that's what it's going to take to get people to go back to work. So that same mindset you have, which is an understandable and reasonable one, a worry based on all this flood of anxiety inducing reporting we've heard, how do we get people back to a mindset of balance and perspective? And yeah, every time I get in my car, there's a risk of dying in a car crash, but I don't drive around at 10 miles an hour because there's a evaluation I make that get going 60 on the highway is dangerous, but it's not that dangerous. And the benefits of getting to work on time or getting to my vacation point on time is more than the risk of death. But those things are all real in our lives in
Right.
any circumstance. So I think we're going to have to apply or add COVID-19 to the list of potential risks out there that we have
Yeah.
to face each day.
Yeah. So no, thank you. So let's try and get this thing out on a positive note, right? So
Yeah.
so you have your live stream tomorrow.
Tomorrow,
Who's
Wednesdays.
on
Yep.
your who's on your show tomorrow?
I've got a UK-based workplace leader, Simone Fenty, and then I have a past guest from my show that I just love. She's from Australia, moved to New York City, is a change management expert,
Mm,
Christina Herrera. Do you remember Christina? I don't know if you heard that episode, one of my favorites, because she tells this story of her trip as a very young person, getting her green card from Australia, Sydney, and moving by herself, leaving her family behind in her early 20s, I think, maybe mid 20s, but heading to New York City and getting a start in the workplace community. And just such a joyful personality and just brave person that I really
yeah.
admire. So she will obviously give us some of that perspective about not living in fear. In fact, her quote, I'll quote it here, and I'm sure I'll share it many times in the coming weeks and months. But a life lived in fear is a life half lived. A
Mm.
life lived in fear is a life half lived. It's from a movie, an Australian rom-com movie, but it's something that's kind of taken on a life of its own. It certainly has meaning in the context of what we just talked
Oh,
about.
for sure.
So that's
Yeah.
tomorrow at noon, Wednesday at noon Eastern, and just go to workplaceinnovator.com to find out more.
Great, great. Whenever you really curious to see your or hear your perspective. I mean, you've done what 85 FM innovator or FM podcasts you did, and then you've done over 100 workplace innovator podcasts. Obviously, I've done my open sourced. One thing I find interesting, I'd be curious to know your perspective, how people fall into this industry, the different backgrounds, the different
Oh,
ways
yeah.
people fall into it. It's just fascinating. There's very few people who I think woke up one day and said, I want to be working workplace and how do I get there? Right.
Oh,
We all kind of fall into it, but the moment we get into it, we just fall in love with it.
yes. The accidental profession is what they've called
Yeah.
it for years.
Yeah.
And I think the FM community, IFMA and other organizations have done a good job trying to make it a career of choice. And that's what the IFMA
Yeah.
Foundation's mission is, to educate high school students and then into colleges, credential programs, and universities around facility management as a profession that you would choose, because it's a very rewarding profession in so many ways. It's a marketing problem in a way, because people just don't know that these roles even exist and when they're coming up. I never heard about it. In fact, it was a little over 10 years ago when I stumbled into the world of IFMA and somebody told me what a facility manager does. But I have a friend of mine, Jeff Snavely, who said, hey, we need to just market it better. If people like to solve problems, they like people, they are, you know, analytical thinkers and compassionate people who like to serve, a service mentality. The role of a building manager or a FM or a workplace leader is something that they should embrace. And the FM pipeline, there's a lot of those folks that stumble in through the trades, through engineering roles
Yep.
and
Yep.
other type of non-college roles. But this managerial approach, the strategic approach, is something that is now trying to be taught in colleges. There are a number of credentialed programs. But I tell you what, I think as the economy evolves and as the world evolves, there's a lot of people who are what we would call traditional FM roles, but they're not called FMs anymore. It's going to be workplace leaders in some broader category. And it's that concierge level of just caring for the people in the built environment. That's what an FM really is at heart. So how did you stumble into corporate real estate? I mean, did you plan to go into real estate or what?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, my background's all finance. I was a business unit CFO, and one of the units I looked after was real estate. So I did a lot of the financial modeling on leases that we were evaluating, running obviously just the financials and what that looked like, putting the business cases together. And I thought, I'd like to have a go at negotiating some of these leases. And I did. And after a couple, I was like, okay, well, yes, leases are a little bit different, but it's not as how can I say it? It didn't give me the same thrill as I thought it would have. I do enjoy it, don't get me wrong, right? But what I did love and what I did fall in love with was workplace. Workplace where you are directly impacting what employees experience,
Mm-hmm.
right? So understanding an employee's needs, understanding their processes, their tasks, how to then optimize the workplace and work environment. And I call it environment, right? Because we talk about place, and place doesn't necessarily have to be the built environment. We look at where we are today. Place can be people's homes, place can be cafes, place can be wherever it is
Yep.
people need to do the work. How do you optimize that environment so that the employees can do what they want? And that's the bit that I loved. Really digging into the data, understanding what the needs were, understanding the data, how we use space, how we pay for space, all those different things to then optimizing the design of that environment. That's what I really loved. And obviously r- real estate lease negotiations, which is, what I do every day, is part of that. But then
Right.
it's also doing that with the understanding of all those other components. And when you understand those components, then I think you become a lot more interested in the actual building, the location, the design of the film, the floor plan of the building, whether it's a central core off to the side, whatever it is, all those components then come into play.
Yep.
Understanding what employees want, then okay, how important is larger windows, access to external space, all these components come into play. So then you feel you're more directly connected, and the leases you're negotiating are more directly connected to the employees that you're serving.
Yep.
So that
So great, because that's the thing. There's the two angles. CoreNet is the other big organization that we're a part of,
right,
obviously, and that's where the corporate real estate side. Your background leads to this kind of from finance and asset, the real estate assets to the workplace, and then you got the FM, which is the maintaining of those buildings, and then moving towards this more strategic workplace, managing the people. And then from here, we'll talk about HR. I've had
yep,
last couple of years, I've had some interaction with the HR community who were up here around, recruitment and onboarding and benefits, and their focus was up here. But then all of a sudden, workplace became their priority because the experience was so important for attracting and retaining talent. So you got these three areas: real estate, facilities, and HR, all coming together. And that's why you have the Workplace Innovator podcast to talk about it
there you
all
go.
right there.
But then you got to bring tech into it as well, right? So the tech that
IT,
enables
IT. Yes.
everything, right? So that's all part of the experience as well. But
I got to
no,
create a new
there was,
logo somehow where there's like the different departments all merging to collaborate.
yeah, and it's getting those, silos to come together, and that's the biggest challenge, right? Many organizations face each day. How do you address some of those things? So
Yep.
it's tough.
Well,
Yeah.
lots more to talk about in the days to
Yep.
come,
For
Steve.
sure,
So
man. For
thanks
sure.
again. You got
Thank
me
you, Mike.
off on the right foot. So have a great
No, I
Tuesday.
appreciate it. You too, mate. Take care.
Talk soon.